TRADCAST Express. TRADCAST Express, it's Monday, June 24th, 2024. You know something is wrong when the Church of Universal Inclusion, Interreligious Dialogue, and Ecumenical Unity in Diversity suddenly remembers that there is such a thing as the crime of schism. Of course, I'm talking about the extrajudicial canonical proceedings the Vatican has now opened against Carlo Maria Viganò, Novus Ordo Archbishop and former Apostolic Nuncio of the Holy See to the United States, charging him with the crime of schism. He's been a thorn in the side of the present so-called Pope ever since August of 2018, when he publicly accused Francis of having known about and helped to cover up the sexual abuse of then-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. Since then, Vigano has been an extremely vocal critic of Francis, not just in terms of his personal behavior, but above all in terms of theology. For years now, the former nuncio has lambasted not only the errors of Jorge Bergoglio, but also of Vatican II and the entire post-conciliar church, which he has called a new parallel church. Although it seems clear that Vigano rejects Francis as a pope, it is not so clear, at least not to me, as what he regards Benedict XVI, John Paul II, John Paul I, Paul VI, and John XXIII. In any case, on June 20th, Vigano disclosed on Twitter and on the website of his Exsurge Domine Foundation that the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith had sent him an email on June 11th summoning him to Rome to receive the charges being made against him. He was to present himself in person at the office of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith on Thursday, June 20th at 3:30 p.m. local time. As could be expected, Vigano decided not to show up. Instead, he released a statement online in which he basically doubled down on his polemic against Francis and the Vatican II religion. Here's just one brief excerpt from this declaration. Quote, "I regard the accusations against me as an honor. I believe that the very wording of the charges confirms the thesis that I have repeatedly defended in my various addresses. It is no coincidence that the accusation against me concerns the questioning of the legitimacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio and the rejection of Vatican II. The Council represents the ideological, theological, moral, and liturgical cancer of which the Bergoglian Synodal Church is the necessary metastasis." Unquote. A little bit later in the same statement, he says, quote, "In the face of the Dicastery's accusations, I claim, as successor of the apostles, to be in full communion with the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church, with the magisterium of the Roman Pontiffs, and with the uninterrupted doctrinal, moral, and liturgical tradition which they have faithfully preserved. I repudiate the neo-modernist errors inherent in the Second Vatican Council and in the so-called post-conciliar magisterium, in particular in matters of collegiality, ecumenism, religious freedom, the secularity of the state, and the liturgy. I repudiate, reject, and condemn the scandals, errors, and heresies of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who manifests an absolutely tyrannical management of power exercised against the purpose that legitimizes authority in the Church, an authority that is vicarious of that of Christ, and as such must obey him alone. This separation of the papacy from its legitimizing principle, which is Christ the high priest, transforms the ministerium into a self-referential tyranny. No Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with this Bergoglian church, because it acts in clear discontinuity and rupture with all the popes of history and with the Church of Christ." Unquote. Now, this is pretty powerful stuff. At the same time, let's not forget that back in 2020, Vigano, even though he was already thundering against the errors of Vatican II, had no problem adopting those errors once more when it seemed politically expedient. For instance, his letter to U.S. President Donald Trump, dated June 7th, 2020, was brimming with the dangerous heresy of naturalism. Later that same year, on December 12th, Vigano participated remotely, along with Taylor Marshall and others, in an interreligious prayer rally in Washington, D.C., that was part of the so-called Jericho March in support of election integrity. The primary purpose of that rally was collective prayer and worship of Catholics, well, Novus Ordos, Protestants, and Jews. In fact, the event ended with the blowing of the Jewish shofar. We've got it all linked in the show notes. So let's not forget this. In any case, it's pretty certain that the Vatican is going to convict Vigano of the charge of schism, for which the penalty is very clear: excommunication. And as far as what they're accusing him of, denial of the legitimacy of Francis, rupture of communion with him, and rejection of the Second Vatican Council, he is guilty as charged, and he's happy not only to admit it, but to preach it from the housetops. In fact, he seems downright excited to be declared out of communion with Jorge Bergoglio. But here is where it gets interesting. See, if the Vatican officially expels Vigano on account of schism, what would that even mean, considering that this is the same Vatican that happily accepts all kinds of schismatics and heretics by way of ecumenism? Does that mean, for example, that Vigano will now get invited to ecumenical gatherings? Is Cardinal Kurt Koch, the chief ecumenist in the Vatican, is he going to start a dialogue and maintain warm, friendly relations with Vigano? Is Francis going to declare that Vigano is a legitimate shepherd of the flock of Christ, as he did with regard to the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill? Or perhaps Francis will sign a document stating that Vigano's theological position contributes to the richness and beauty of that mosaic that is made up of the various religions of the world, all willed by God, as he claims, as an expression of God's infinite wisdom and power. Could it be that Francis will now allow Vigano to offer Mass at the Cathedral of St. John Lateran, or another historic Roman basilica, as he has allowed invalid Anglican pseudo-clergy to simulate Mass there? And by the way, what happened to sticking up for the excluded? You know, the outcast and most marginalized and all that. And besides, Vigano is in his 80s, so doesn't that also make him kind of vulnerable, you know? I mean, he's elderly, unemployed, and I'm sure he suffers from an ailment or two. So will Francis declare that we should encounter the face of Christ in Carlo Maria Viganò? Well, I doubt it. Or wait, he'd probably have to migrate somewhere first, if you get my drift. Well, anyway, this is going to be really, really fun to witness in the next few weeks, because Bergoglio's sect is now forced to reveal its double standard in a rather obvious way. See, while constantly condemning the throwaway culture and preaching a culture of inclusion, they are now preparing to throw out, exclude, and marginalize one of their own. Well, these are logical chickens coming home to roost. Theology has consequences. They simply can't have it both ways. Francis can't say, on the one hand, that no one can exclude himself from the church, and even heretics and apostates are included. And yes, he did say that. Check the show notes. And then declare that Vigano has left the church, is excommunicated, is a schismatic, and so on. So these people are about to make real fools of themselves because there's no way they can get out of that conundrum. So maybe stock up on some popcorn there. Hey, let me make a prediction right here, right now. Admittedly, one that's not terribly difficult to make. When the Vatican issues the condemnation of Vigano, he won't be getting the ecumenical treatment. We won't be seeing anything like, well, what unites us is so much greater than what divides us, or we reject nothing that is true and holy in what Archbishop Vigano has written. There'll be nothing about partial communion either. In fact, the Vatican decree summoning Vigano talks about rupture of communion with Francis and a denial of the elements necessary to maintain communion with the Catholic Church. Nothing there about a communion that, although imperfect, is nevertheless very real. Right? Furthermore, in the Vatican's condemnation of Vigano, there will presumably be nothing about how the Holy Ghost uses him as means of salvation. He might have to join the Lutherans for that to apply. There will be nothing about how, on account of his baptism, he is a child of God and has the right to be called a Christian. Nor will there be any statement to the effect that it doesn't matter what he says about Francis or Vatican II, he doesn't lose his dignity. We also won't hear anything about how their religious differences with him are necessary and simply another way of approaching God. Even though, according to Vatican II Ecclesiology, there is basically a little bit of the Catholic Church in every religion, at least in those that retain the sacrament of baptism, I don't think we'll hear anything about the ecclesial elements that are to be found in Vigano's ministry. No, I think instead we're going to hear about schism, schism, schism. But let's be clear about something. The essence of genuine schism is a willful rebellion against the lawful supreme authority. It is not simply being wrong about who holds that supreme authority and refusing submission for that reason. That's why during the Great Western Schism, when up to 3 different bishops claimed to be the Pope at the same time, there was a schism in a material sense only, in the sense of there being an actual division. But there was no formal schism because the people weren't willfully trying to refuse submission to the actual Pope. They were just totally confused about and divided on who was the real Pope. So if you submitted to one as the true Pope, you necessarily refused submission to the other 2. So one way or another, you were necessarily refusing submission to someone claiming to be Pope. But as long as you were willing to submit to the real Pope, whoever it was, and you just couldn't figure out who it was, well, then you weren't guilty of true and proper schism. Likewise, we sedevacantists refuse submission to Francis because we believe he's not the Pope. Now, you might say we're wrong, fine, and then we can argue about that, but you couldn't accuse us of being formal schismatics. Why would we submit to someone we don't believe is actually the Pope? It makes no sense. So, it is actually part of the essence of schism to refuse submission to the man you acknowledge as the true Pope and as having the right to rule the Church. Which brings me to an important quote that I put on the Novus Ordo Wire blog the other day from the Wernz-Vidal Canon Law Manual published in Rome in 1937 regarding the sense and scope of schism. Quote, "The requirement for determining at law the delict of pure schism is, 1. That someone withdraw from the sphere of authority of the Roman pontiff and separate himself from the ecclesiastical communion of the other faithful, either directly or expressly, or indirectly, or with implicit or tacit consent, even if he may not attach himself to a separated schismatic sect. 2. That the withdrawal be connected with pertinacity or rebellion. 3. That the withdrawal be done with respect to those things on which the unity of the Church is founded. 4. Notwithstanding formal disobedience and denial of being subordinate, that the schismatic acknowledge that the aforementioned Roman pontiff is the true pastor of the universal Church, and that obedience must be offered to him in accordance with the teaching of the faith. But if he says the Pope is not the true pastor of the universal Church, heresy will be added as an ingredient to schism. Wherefore, the delict of schism, in the strict sense, is not committed by him who withdraws from his own bishop and from the communion of the faithful of his own diocese, but by him who refuses to be under the Roman pontiff and to be in communion with the rest of the faithful of the universal Church. Nor is someone determined to be a schismatic by means of a simple transgression of pontifical law. Otherwise, all violators of universal ecclesiastical laws would also prove to be schismatics, something that is plainly absurd. Finally, those cannot be regarded as schismatics who refuse to obey a Roman pontiff because they are suspicious of his person or because of unfavorable reports spread abroad that he was doubtfully elected, as happened after the election of Urban VI, or those who may resist him as a civil ruler and not as shepherd of the church." Unquote. All of that is in the show notes as well. So with that Vigano story, June 20th this year was clearly a very busy news day. But do you know what else happened on June 20th at the Vatican? Pope Francis met with a delegation of Lutherans. Yeah, yet another one. And of course, he offered some of the usual ecumenical blah blah. This time he said they're all pilgrims of hope. All right? And he claimed that Jesus Christ is the heart of ecumenism. Anyway, he wrapped up his fairly short speech with the following, quote, "On this journey of ecumenism, I am reminded of a beautiful comment made by Bishop Zizioulas. This Orthodox bishop, pioneer of ecumenism, used to say that he knew the date of when Christians would unite, the day of the final judgment. But in the meantime, he said that we must walk together, pray together, and do charitable work together as we head toward that hyper-ecumenical day of the final judgment." He really said that. Zizioulas had a good sense of humor. Unquote. Yeah, a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there, but it's a dangerous idea to float because in actual fact, the Last Judgment will not unite all Christians. As some would have it, it will be the ultimate day of division. The sheep will be separated from the goats, definitively and for all eternity. As the Council of Florence taught solemnly, quote, the Council, firmly believes, professes, and proclaims that those not living within the Catholic Church, not only pagans, but also Jews and heretics and schismatics, cannot become partakers in eternal life, but will depart into everlasting fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels, unless, before the end of life, the same have been added to the flock, and that the unity of the ecclesiastical body is so strong that only to those remaining in it are the sacraments of the Church of benefit for salvation, and do fastings, almsgiving, and other functions of piety and exercises of Christian service produce eternal reward, and that no one, whatever almsgiving he has practiced, even if he has shed blood for the name of Christ, can be saved, unless he has remained in the bosom and unity of the Catholic Church." Unquote. That's, again, the Council of Florence from the decree Cantate Domino, found in Denzinger number 714. Now, that is Catholic dogma, and clearly not something believed or taught by the Vatican II Church, least of all Jorge Bergoglio. But don't be surprised if Francis and his henchmen will suddenly dig up that quote again. No, not to share it with the Lutherans or the Jews or the Orthodox or the Muslims. No, they will suddenly recall that unpopular teaching only in another context. When it comes time to pronounce sentence against Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò. TRADCAST Express is a production of Novus Ordo Watch. Check us out at tradcast.org, and if you like what we're doing, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution at novusordowatch.org/donate.